So first of all, please welcome to open us off Baroness Ruth Lister.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I very much welcome the focus of the discussion, because it serves as a reminder that many of the consequences of austerity have human rights implications. And I'm going to be talking about social and economic human rights as enshrined in the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which the UK has ratified but has not incorporated into domestic law. So I'm not talking about some of those bigger issues that Mathew mentioned, but I'm sure we can come back to those in discussion. And although sometimes treated as the poor cousin of political and civil rights, they're just as important. And indeed, human rights principles are based on their indivisibility or interdependence. Indeed, the Covenant's preamble declares that, I quote, "The ideal of free human beings enjoying freedom from fear and want can only be achieved if conditions are created whereby everyone may enjoy their economic, social and cultural rights as well as their civil and political rights." And I'm basing my remarks largely on a recent submission to the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from Just Fair, a charity set up by lawyers to advance in particular economic, social and cultural rights, and of which I'm a patron. And I'll focus mainly on the right to social security, so we'll also talk about the welfare reform and work bill, which is currently preoccupying me in the Lords, and which I'm afraid meant I've not been able to give as much thought perhaps as I might have wanted to this evening in preparation. Now, the UN Committee has declared that the duty of states to protect the vulnerable members of their societies assumes greater rather than less importance in times of severe resource constraints. The government would argue it's protecting the so-called vulnerable, but seems to operate with a very narrow understanding of vulnerability. It's also worth pointing out that the severe resource constraints under which it's working are a political choice. For instance, it does not have to aim for a budget surplus. And as Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, hardly the most radical of newspapers, argued recently, the decision to make virtually all the post-crisis fiscal adjustments via cuts in spending is extreme, not least because the ratio of spending to GDP will fall to levels briefly touched only twice since 1948. Now, this has changed slightly as a result of the autumn statement, but don't be fooled by the headlines suggesting that that marked the end of austerity. Actually, I'm not sure we should even be using the term austerity, because it conjures up images of us all pulling together, in the national interest, and which masks the extent to which the cuts made in the name of austerity largely represent an ideological choice to shrink the welfare state. Now, both the UN Committee and the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe have emphasised the obligation on nation-states to continue to make progress towards realising economic, social and cultural rights, and to avoid what's called retrogression, i.e. a diminution of existing rights despite the state of the global economy. And where there is retrogression, it must be temporary, necessary and proportionate, must not be discriminatory in nature or effects, and must protect the core of the effective right. And Just Fair's overall conclusion is that even taking account of the prevailing economic conditions, the UK appears to have engaged in impermissible retrogression in relation to certain rights. And it bases this conclusion on a series of reports that have documented in great detail an assault on the right to housing, leading to rising homelessness, the right to health, the right to food, the denial of which is all too visible in the shameful reliance on charitable food banks, and on disabled people's rights. And it criticises the government for repeatedly failing to properly evaluate and examine the human rights implications of its policies, and to undertake cumulative impact assessments of measures such as social security cuts, a demand that's been made repeatedly to no avail by the disabled people's movement. The government responds that cumulative impact assessment is impossible, yet the Institute for Fiscal Studies has disputed this while acknowledging the difficulties. And indeed, the Equality and Human Rights Commission commissioned its own assessment of the cumulative impact of tax benefit and public spending decisions on households containing at least one member with a protected characteristic. Among its findings was that households containing a disabled person have been disproportionately adversely affected by reductions in benefits and public spending, with households containing a disabled child particularly badly affected. And under the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the UK is required to respect, protect and fulfil disabled people's right to independent living. Just Fair argues that when disabled people are hit by 2, 3, 4 or even more separate changes to benefit social care and other services, they lose much of the support they need to live independently in the community in terms of the Convention. Thus, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is currently investigating the effect of cuts on the human rights of disabled people in the UK. And the UK has already been criticised by the UN Special Investigator on Housing, who warned that the bedroom tax could constitute a violation of the human right to adequate housing, to the fury of the government, who branded her report as Marxist. And some disabled people stand to be hit again by the Welfare Reform and Work Bill, as new claimants will lose the additional payment made to those placed in the what's called the work-related activity group, people who are deemed not fit actually to undertake work, but can do activities that might get them closer to the labour market. So that benefit will be reduced by about £30 a week to the same level as job seekers' allowance, the level of which has been branded as manifestly inadequate by the European Committee on Social Rights. Families of children are going to be disproportionately hit by the bill, with potentially serious implications for child poverty levels, although the bill conveniently abolishes the statutory income and deprivation measures of child poverty and associated duties and targets. Instead, there will be just 2 statutory life chance measures of worklessness and educational attainment. And in its last report to the last Parliament, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, of which I was then a member, made clear that child poverty is a human rights issue and expressed disappointment that disadvantaged children had suffered disproportionately from austerity measures. Evidence of this is provided by a child rights impact assessment of the cumulative impact of tax benefit changes and reductions in spending on services between 2010 and 2015, published by the Office of the Children's Commissioner for England. And that concluded that overall the evidence in this report suggested the best interests of children are not being treated as a primary consideration in line with Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the design of fiscal measures relating to welfare benefits, tax credits and taxes. The same can be said of the Welfare Reform and Work Bill, in particular the removal of means-tested financial support from third and subsequent children and a reduction in the benefit cap to an arbitrary level no longer linked to average earnings is bound to increase child poverty by hitting large and minority ethnic families particularly hard. And the introduction of a lower level of the cap outside London means that families in regions such as the East Midlands are likely to be hit much harder than they have been up till now. Benefit cap hasn't been such an issue in the East Midlands up to now, but it's going to be. The Supreme Court recently considered the benefit cap, and although it didn't allow the appeal, 3 out of 5 of the judges believed that the cap is not compliant with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the requirement to treat the best interests of the child as a primary consideration. And the hope was expressed that the government would address the implications of this finding when it reviewed the cap. Well, some hope. Also, the judgment referred to what I have always argued is a particular iniquity, that the cap does not compare like with like. Families on the level of earnings with which the cap is being compared will be receiving child benefit and property child tax credit, but this is ignored, and yet these benefits are included in the cap itself. And so the government goes on about fairness between those in and out of work. The implication is that it is comparing like with like when it isn't. And so while it continually justifies the cap as fair, I would argue this is far from fair. Moreover, I would argue that it's wrong deliberately to reduce the income that a family gets below the level that Parliament has deemed as necessary to meet its needs. minimum which is well below the minimum income standards that research actually at Loughborough University shows that what the general public believes is necessary for a socially acceptable standard of living. And just a week or so ago, a High Court judge ruled that the failure to exempt all those in receipt of carers allowance amounted to indirect discrimination against disabled people and is therefore unlawful. And it's going to be interesting to see what the government has to say about that, but I suspect it will appeal. Now, on top of these cuts, most working age benefits, other than those associated with the cost of disability or carers allowance, are to be frozen completely for 4 years. And this is on top of cuts already made to their real value under the coalition government. And according to the Institute for Statistical Studies, the impact will be highly regressive. Not only will children be disproportionately hit, but women will be also. Both because they are more likely to be claiming many years of benefits and because as the managers of poverty, they will bear much of the burden at the expense of their physical and mental health. And a particularly vulnerable group of children will also be hard hit by a big cut in their asylum support, which was sneaked out over the summer, and by further cuts contained in the immigration bill currently before Parliament. All these cuts are having a devastating impact on the health and well-being of people ill-placed to cope with them. The journalist Maria O'Hara recently reported that after 5 years of austerity in the UK, with billions of pounds more budget cuts on the way, families, charities, mental health professionals, campaigners and researchers have been highlighting what they regard as the profound effects of austerity on mental health. Earlier, in a book based on talking to people all over the country in the early days of the cuts, she wrote, "If there was one word to capture the mood during the months that I travelled the country, it was fear. I talked to people afraid of cuts that had yet to be fully felt, of losing their home, of disability benefits being snatched away, of being unable to take care of their children or sick or elderly relatives, of essential local services being eliminated, and of their mental health deteriorating. The more the shockwaves of austerity were absorbed, the more initial fears about what might happen mutated into a daily dread about how to survive." Of course, that daily dread is not being felt by the privileged, who for the most part have been completely protected. Security has been one of the government's watchwords, yet through a succession of cuts, it's undermining the security as well as the economic and social rights of large numbers of people at the bottom of our appallingly unequal and divided society. Thanks.